for those of you who didn't get a chance, we have a document that Ray has sent us entitled Why and How Capitalism Needs to be Reformed. It's being handed out. If you didn't get on the way in, please get on the way out and read it. I've read it several times. I have it dog-eared here. And I think it's quite interesting. You do diagnostics of the problem and of your assessment of how we should, as a group, as a society, a larger society, should think about how we respond. So what motivated you to write this? And maybe tell us a little bit about how you see the solutions.
Well, what motivated me to write it is that I care about this. I'm a technician of sorts, meaning I know mechanics, and I see that we're in a situation in which truth. Rationality is not being brought to bear on what I believe is probably our biggest problem. I think that the world right now has three main issues, right? To give you a little bit of a template. I think that there's productivity. When I look at any economy, I look at, productivity. You learn more, you improve, and you raise your living standards over a period of time. There's a short-term debt cycle or business cycle that we're all acquainted with. There is a longer-term debt cycle that has its limitations, and there is politics. And so I look at everything through those lenses. Productivity is a lot, technologies that are replacing people. In terms of the shorter-term debt cycle, we're 10 years into it, and for various reasons, it will fade. The long-term debt cycle, by that I mean the limitations of monetary policy and being able to stimulate demand through the stimulation of credit by lowering interest rates and doing quantitative easing. It is reaching its limits. Next downturn, we will not have monetary policy as we know it.
Right.
And then politics. And these are all intertwined. So what we are seeing today is something that's analogous to the 1930s in that I think the three biggest issues are the wealth gap, because history has shown us that if there's a large wealth gap and a large values gap, that there is populism of the left and populism of the right, great political polarity, and that can be dysfunctional and actually very detrimental. So we have a situation in which there will be a downturn, and if we're at each other's throats now about that issue, right. And we have a downturn, and we have a lack of effective monetary policy, we have a very serious problem internally. We also have a situation where we have, like the 30s, a rising country challenging an existing world power, China challenging the United States. So there's a lot of internal conflict about that issue. We'll see it in the elections. We're seeing how that essentially populism of the left and populism of the right are emerging. So when I step back, I think, what are we going after? I grew up in a time where we all believed, we never achieved it fully, but we all believed in equal opportunity. So I think we have a system right now. I'm a capitalist,
sure. Mm-hmm.
But we have a system in which if we step back and say, is it producing the outcomes that we would want? We would say it's not. It's not fair. Equal opportunity is not fair. It's not something like even being approached. And it's also not sustainable, because when we have the downturn, we're more likely to have extremism of one form or another, and when we have that, we'll have stupid policies at the same time, which will be self-sustainingly negative, I think. So when one's compelled to see these things, I see these things, I've felt the responsibility to convey them in that piece.
And is the failures that you see a product of institutional failure? Is it a product of vision? Is it a product of leadership? And I say that last night we were at a dinner celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Bretton Woods institutions, and I'm a believer that institutions matter. Are institutions failing, or do we have the wrong institutions? Do we need to invent new institutions? Is it an institutional issue, or is it just one of personal leadership and vision?
No, I think it's mostly, there's a certain mechanical thing that's going on. And there's not a stepping back in a thoughtful way to say, are the outcomes not acceptable, and then how do you engineer it? So what I mean is, I don't think there are good guys and bad guys doing things. I think there's a lot of self-interest and also a profit motivation, which is capitalism. It's a good thing. It allocates resource effectively. But it also has the effect in that largely focus on profit in that way, to have companies use technologies, invent technologies, and that rewards people. And those rewarding of people in that way creates mechanistically a replacing of people. So that's one of them, technology. The second is in the understandable pursuit of profit and efficiency. When we have globalization, you go to wherever it could be produced most cost effectively, and that loses a percentage of the population because then they don't have employment. And then thirdly, you have a monetary policy that has necessitated the purchases of financial assets. Quantitative easing means that the central bank purchases financial assets. And when they do, they give cash for financial assets, and those investors take that and buy more financial assets. And so if you look at those institutions, financial institutions, pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, they're awash in money, and they're trying to find what to receive an income in. They're awash on money, and that has pushed also financial asset prices higher. But that does not translated mechanistically to lending in its normal ways to the majority of the population, partially because, or significantly because that percentage of the population's income and balance sheets are not so great. So if you say, why don't you lend to that population in a normal mechanistic way, the lending comes because that becomes a source of capital, but that has a problem because of the wealth gap. That has then in turn translated into resource deficiencies such as education resource deficiencies. So let's say if you were to take education by way of example, which is a fundamental, probably the most fundamental element to equality and well-being, because that, let's say in the United States, the money doesn't go there effectively. Partially because in the Constitution of the United States it's a state issue, and then it goes into a tax district issue. So those who have the money provide good education for theirs, but then there is not good education for the average population. To put that in perspective, I broke the economy up into the top 40% and the bottom 60%, and the amount of money that goes for the education of those in the top 40% is per capita for the children is 5 times that which is in the bottom. And so that lessens that education. And it has consequences like incarceration rates and so on. So there's an ecosystem here that's mechanical. I think, everyone does want to take care pretty much of themselves and they go beyond it. And that system mechanistically needs to be reformed to achieve the objective. So I think if we just step back and say, is this what we want in outcome? And I know all of you've got a bunch of smart people. If we were to all sit down and say, okay, let's just look at it in an engineering kind of way, the machine. Okay, do we agree the outcomes are not consistent with the goals and that it's dangerous? And then how could we, the IIF or somebody, engineer it, literally re-engineer it? And that could be done it needs to be done in a bipartisan or nonpartisan way, and it needs to be done in an intelligent way in order to achieve that objective. So that's how it looks to me. I don't think that's likely because of the polarity and the emotionality.
Jesse Jackson famously said, capitalism without capital is just another ism. And you've talked about the importance of human capital, of education, which I want to dwell on a second, and then I want to come back to financial capital. One of the challenges for education in the United States, and you and I chatted about phone the other day, and then I went and looked at the statistics. It's some of the largest educational districts, including the District of Columbia, spends over $20,000 a year per capita for K through 12, and those numbers have continued to go up. But the outcomes aren't great. If you have 100 eighth graders sitting in here in the room, 25 of them won't ever get out of high school, and 25 of those who do get out of high school can't read at grade level. So you've lost half the class that simply can't read or write or compute at their grade level. How do we fix this? Of those eighth graders, only 18 will actually go on and graduate from college within 5 years, 18 out of 100. How do we fix the system in addition to just more resources? Because I agree we need more resources, teachers underpaid. But how do we fix the system?
It happens to be a subject that I'm well informed about only because my wife over the last 10 years has focused in exactly that in the Connecticut public school systems to go to high schools where there's a big wealth gap and you can't get the kids through high school. So her main mission is, and we've just made a matching donation with the state of Connecticut. We donated $100 million and they donated $100 million for the purpose of getting that population of kids that you're referring to through high school and into jobs. And so that's a mission that we're on, and I have acquaintance with that. So we have a number of things. The dynamic is working in the following way. First, the communities and the families are in terrible shape. So there's a poverty issue, there's a nutrition issue, there's a parental issue that is a self-reinforcing cycle. The basic ingredients that you need to have a successful life is you have parents or adults who care about your well-being, affect what your values are like, and nurture you. You have basic nutrition, and then you have those things. You have a safe environment, and then you go to school that gives you a good education. I think that's true it's essential for everybody. It's the only thing I had, and it's the only thing that's most important. And so we have a self-reinforcing cycle in which that doesn't exist for a number of reasons. And there are big, effective things that can be done. There's definitely a resource allocation in that process, and there's that self-reinforcing. For example, the child who doesn't go through high school, and then the statistics are something like a 25% higher probability of being incarcerated. Okay, the average incarceration rate costs between $80,000 and $120,000 a year. So that is an expensive burden on the society. For example, state of Connecticut spends $600 million a year on incarceration rates. So, and it can be very cost effectively move them to get them through high school. Even those with that type of population can be gotten through high school. My wife is working on programs because they drop out in between 8th and 9th grade. They have no path to success. So they have no idea that there's a job at the end of that. And their community is a gang. Everyone wants a community. And their community, which is a practical community, is a gang and crime related, and maybe drugs and something along those lines. And so at that point, school isn't working for them, and their community is that. So we're doing that. That's what this $200 million is about, to be able to cost effectively get them through high school and into trade jobs. If you were to look at examples of differences in that approach, I'd suggest you look at the government of Singapore's approach to that and say these same issues. There are different approaches to these issues, and everybody could be useful. For example, in the government of Singapore, they'll take the bottom 25% of the population, they'll find out who that is, and they will create a college for those, and they will have training for those, and they'll get a pride. They call them tactile learners. In other words, those who can work with on machine engines, or they work in various jobs that are suited for them. Those people have a pride in what they're doing, and they are trained at a certain area to have that pride and to be effective and to have employment. So I would say there are models around that can be achieved. And at the same time, the resource allocation is so bad. I'll give you an example. Hartford, Connecticut, which used to be the insurance capital of the world, it is now, because of the hollowing out, a terrible place. And my wife was with the mayor, and she's seeing that children are having a problem getting to school because they have to walk through an area where there are gangs and there are shootings. This is literally the case. And she asks the mayor of Hartford, why can't we have a policeman assure safe passage to get through that? He said, well, we can only have 275 policemen in the city of Connecticut, Hartford, because that's all we can afford to have, because the tax base there means he has to make choices of that or food or whatever. And so there's a budget problem that contributes to this issue. So you have a cycle in which this cycle is a self-perpetuating downward spiral, because if tax rates rise, then people leave that area, or if conditions deteriorate, they leave that area and they go to another area. So these are the mechanistic things that are happening to produce that.
Another one of your publications is that I carry with me is Principles for Navigating the Big Debt Crisis. We follow debt levels here. We do debt reports, debt accumulation reports. I cited some statistics this morning. Are you worried about where we are in debt accumulation at the household, sovereign, or global level? Or are we near tipping points? As you look at debt accumulation around the world, are you concerned?
I look at things in a very mechanical way. And so what concerns me about debt, we're in a new world now. And what concerns me about debt is the nature of the dynamic in which you don't have to service debt. And what I mean by that is, to a larger extent than ever before, this debt growth, the maturity of the debt has been extended a lot. The interest rate becomes negative or near negative, right. So the debt service payments for the interest rate go down a lot. And it's almost the situation where there's guaranteed debt rollovers. So principal does not have to be rolled over in a number of cases, right. And there's low covenants. And so when you start to look at this, the thing you say, what is going to cause a debt service problem? In 2007, we calculated that we would have the 2008 financial crisis by doing those pro forma numbers. Mm-hmm. And then when we're dealing now in this seemingly crazy or odd other reality in which you don't have to pay interest and you don't have to roll over your debt, and then you play with negative interest rates, you say, how will that work? Okay? And so if we look at periods of time in history and where somewhat those types of things happen, maybe, for example, the war years. If we look at the war years and we look at, let's call yield curve targeting with the low interest rates and the mechanics of that, that produces a different kind of mechanics now. So when I look at what's ahead and I think about that, it stretches my imagination, because I know even beyond that, we will have much larger deficits. So if not only do we have the debts that you're referring to, right, and their maturities, but we'll have larger deficits which will grow. And in addition, we have pension liabilities and healthcare liabilities and other forms of liabilities that'll come at us. They're very cash flow driven because you'll have to make those types of payments. And so they're coming at us at the same time. And then you deal with, okay, how will that be dealt with and funded? So you have to go through the imagination of the fact that they will probably be monetized. And in other words, they'll have debt. Central banks will be in a position that they'll have to buy the debt. And so as we go from other countries, let's say if we go from Japan, which 46% of its very large debt is owned by the Bank of Japan, and we keep moving that up, that's the mechanics that we have in place. And so when I extend that and I look at that, I think we are in the last stages, or the end of last stages, of what is currency, what is a reserve currency, how does that our fiat monetary system work? Because let's say a currency, a bond is an asset that is a promise to receive a lot of currency. Okay, now how much do I want that? And because I'm going to have, let's say, a negative interest rate or close to a negative interest rate. So, then you start to think of the arbitrages. Do I want the paper currency in the thing? Do I want gold? Do I want some other alternative type of currency? And then increasingly, there will de facto be taxes on owning that asset. Because a negative interest rate is a form of taxes. And as we go more and more to digital currencies, the arbitrage between putting paper in a vault will be increasingly eliminated. So we're at when I talk about the long-term debt cycle, I mean that there's, in the history, you wipe out the debts, and then you don't have debts. And then you can create that stimulation, and that happens, and you always hit it with a jolt of stimulation until then you get to interest rates hitting zero or close to zero, and then they don't work. So that's monetary policy. One is interest rates. Monetary policy two is then when that doesn't work, you print money and you buy it. When that doesn't work, you have this phenomenon that we're in. We're at the end of the long-term debt cycle, and you have the dynamic. So the classic debt crisis that we're looking at doesn't look like the ones that I've seen in the past. It looks more like the ones in the late 30s when we're at the end of that cycle. Because in the past, the way they would happen would be, do you have a certain amount of debt? And the economy's overheating. Central bank tightens monetary policy. Or even that you run through and you say, what's the debt rollover problem? Right. So we're not going to have the classic debt rollover problem. We're not going to have the classic tightening of monetary policy. So when we think about those things and say, are we going to have a debt problem, we have things to be concerned about in the way I'm describing, but they're not going to be the classic ways that this has come to an end.
If we can't afford the liabilities, and I agree with you, if you look at the net present value of the U.S. government's entitlement program, the gap, the net present value is about $35 trillion. And add to that $20 trillion in federal debt, and we're adding $1 trillion a year. So huge sums of money. If, to your point, that we end up canceling or reducing those liabilities, for every liability that's an asset, so someone who's holding that asset is going to be poorer, and there could be a distributional piece of that. So to your point, if we simply write off the debt, we're destroying a tremendous amount of wealth.
Right. So the way that it'll be done is by printing it and devaluing the currency, because that's the very subtle way, and it's also it looks good, because when you have a currency depreciation, first of all, it's very hidden tax, right? If you put a negative interest rate, it's not like a tax rate change. Right. That's controversial. You just have a negative interest rate, and okay, that's one form of tax. And when you have a currency depreciation, it causes one's assets to go up. It'll be inclined to make the stock market go up. Depreciate the currency. That was one of my great lessons. I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in 1971 when August 15th, 1971, Sunday night, Nixon floated the dollar.
Right.
And I went on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange then, clerking, and I thought, wow, we have a real crisis here. And the stock market rose the most in my lifetime, because a currency depreciation also tends to raise asset prices in various ways. So if you're in that position, the hidden way, the effective way to do that is to monetize the debt and have the depreciation as distinct from, like, you write it down, and like you say, somebody's assets. That doesn't work. We cover these things in that book. By the way, that book, if you're interested, Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crisis, is available free online at economicprinciples.com. But it's... So these things have happened over and over again. I think mechanistically it means that we will print the money. That doesn't mean necessarily inflationary,
right.
Okay? Like in the 1930s, we had a series of currency depreciations, a lot of printing of money, but you also had the other forces that meant that. And so I think it'll be kind of seemingly hidden, but we're still right close to the point where you may not want to own those bonds, okay? And you'll look for what else. And the question is, what else?
Right.
What is that else, okay? That's the environment I think that we'll be in. And as we solve the what else, is that another currency? No, it's not one of the major reserve currencies. Is it not reserve currency?
Is it digital
currencies? Is it current? Well, the digital currencies, I think the fundamental purpose of a currency is to be a medium of exchange and a storehold of wealth. And I think you could create effective digital currencies if you achieve those two things, and that there's a fixing of what is the link to,
right.
that essentially creates that. Now the question is, so I think they can be designed effectively. I think that, and then there's pros and cons to them. I think the question is, do governments allow that? If I was a government, I wouldn't want to allow that.
Right.
So I doubt that they will be allowed, and I don't think, so maybe they're evolutionary, but it's almost like it's got to be under the legal system practically, and I don't think that'll happen. So, and also it doesn't have a long track record. So if we take central banks and so on, how quickly will they buy digital currencies? They're not going to go to digital currency. If you take the big money in the world, institutional investors and whatever, digital currencies are not tried and true, and we're even trying to find, is there going to be one,
right.
and how will it work? So it's too premature for anybody to invest in any way. I think that far more likely you get to gold. Okay, gold will be, they have reserves in the gold. You see how reserves are being changed. You see,
Russia,
Russia, China, other countries. Well, even if you think of, let's say, China or Russia situation, I read history and it's educational. And I think like the 30s is a very interesting period to read because we had those dynamics of the same forces. And so when Japan was rising relative to the rest of the world in the United States, there was a trade war, there was a technology war, there was a capital war, and there was a geopolitical war that went up until then it culminated in 1941 with the dropping of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. In those wars, there was capital wars, and the capital war meant also the freezing of assets. If you look at right now, the United States, the President of the United States has the ability at will to not pay China's debt, to at will say, we'll call it freezing of assets and that kind of thing. Now, just the ability to do that in the nature of the conflict we're having is a scary thing.
Yes.
Okay? Very scary thing, right. I'm not saying it's going to happen, okay, right. But I'm saying that we have to recognize that there are such possibilities that exist and that they put into place their own dynamic. Like how much, there's a saying that gold is the only asset you can have that's not somebody else's liability. So anyway, I don't know what those alternatives are, but I would say if gold is more likely than the other, but the gold market's very small in relationship to all the capital markets. Right. Anyway, we will have interesting puzzles to solve, right?
Ray, unfortunately, we run out of time. I've just gotten started. I only got through the first question of 3 pages of questions. Can I invite you back sometime?
I'll look forward to it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ray Dalio.